Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to Watchbox and welcome back to Versus, another one of my mini verses where I take two watches and off the cuff, quite literally, give you my takes, comparisons, and ultimately my judgment on which of these two watches I would rather own. Today we have two things that are not alike. Well, except in as much as they are automatic winding full bracelet steel sports watches from two of the greatest brands in the world, both local to the canton of Geneva. So we have the Rolex Oyster Perpetual Yacht-Master versus the Patek Philippe Nautilus. So on the left you have the reference 116622 in steel and platinum, and then you have the Nautilus, as it was made from 2012 to 2020, with a silver-white dial. This is reference 57111-011. Let's zoom out a little bit and then get started because there's a lot to tell here. And the reason I am comparing these dissimilar watches is because I want to show you how much you can get without spending the equivalent of a Midwestern American house on a single watch. So let's start with the Rolex Yacht-Master. Of course, the Yacht-Master was originally launched in 1992, but the model you see right here was built as you see it right here from approximately 2012 to 2020. Now the watch has been re-engined. It is no longer powered by the 3135. This one is, but the current version, which costs $12,450, is powered by the 70-hour power reserve 3235. So keep that in mind. We'll come back to it. This watch, pre-owned, is selling for $12,000 on our website. So as far as modern steel, rotating bezel, full bracelet Rolex sports watches go, this one is priced, as I would describe, fairly. A watch that is accessible, available immediately, and available without a great premium over its MSRP. So 40 millimeters in diameter, the timepiece measures relatively svelte for Rolex, 11.6 millimeters thick. Lug-to-lug it is 47.3 millimeters, and then if you include the end links of the bracelet, the absolute distance across the wrist is 49.8 millimeters, with a 20 millimeter spacing between the lugs. As I mentioned, there is a current reference, the $12,450 126622 is identical to this watch with the exception of the longer power reserve. So on the wrist, this is exactly what the current model looks like. It's going to be nice and flat, broad, as the Oyster case has always been more of a cushion case than a round case. And you can see that the edges of the lugs are nowhere near the edge of my wrist. So I can recommend this watch for a smaller wrist than mine, probably even a wrist as small as 13.5 to 14 centimeters circumference. It's a good looker and an all-arounder. A sports watch, dress watch, it could be a watch for him or for her, and as you'll note, it is flatter even than the Submariner, so it sits lower on the wrist and ducks a cuff more easily. The Oyster bracelet is classic. It's something that just screams Rolex. I show you this, you already know who made the watch. It's as iconic in its way as the Panerai Crown Guard. Now, as you can see, the bracelet includes primarily polished and satinated components, and removable links here are fixed in place by screws. And then we have the wonderful Easy Link internal 5 millimeter adjustment. So we have this system that allows you to effectively add or remove the equivalent of one sizable link. It's an in and out snap adjustment without any tools required. You can also see there are 3 divots drilled inside the clasp, and those little drilled divots allow you to re-anchor the bracelet inside the clasp. So you can remove or add links, you can use Easy Link, or you can use your strap tool to re-anchor the bracelet in the clasp. So 3 ways to size this bracelet. The case is fluid and fantastic. Lovely, flowing, tapered, all of high polish, graceful. It looks a lot like the Daytona case, and it has the same effortless elegance of that model. Now you can see there is a Triplock Crown here, so the watch is 100 meters rated. I suspect reality might be a little bit more because the Triplock is what you'll find on, for example, the Sea Dwellers and the Submariners. Now this watch does have a precious metal component. On the dial, the hands as well as the indices are white gold, and then the bezel itself is a solid piece of bidirectional rotating platinum. So the watch is a little heftier than you might expect given its steel construction and its 40 millimeter size. Now you see there's a combination of relieved and polished elements and then media blasting, and the whole thing, not just the insert, is platinum. You line it up with the minute hand, and it's not a diving bezel, but it is a very handy 0 to 60 minute timer. The watch has a lovely colorful dial with a sunburst metallic grain, the white gold individual indices, the white on blue print, and then a few well-chosen shocks of red with the seconds hand varnished red. Inside the case, this version has the 3135 with a 48-hour power reserve, but the current version of this watch, which is basically the same watch at the same price, has a 70-hour power reserve with caliber 3235, so keep that in mind. Now the movement here is otherwise identical to the movement in the current latest version of the watch. So bidirectional winding, 31 joules, 4 hertz beat rate, quick set date, stop seconds. a full balance bridge with a free sprung index and also an overcoil hairspring. The full balance bridge with the free sprung index makes it shock tolerant, and then you have an overcoil to allow it to keep excellent time in any orientation with respect to gravity. One more change from the 3135 to the 3235 is that this watch's jeweled staff for the winding rotor has been replaced by a rotor bearing on the newer movement, which makes it even tougher. And of course, both of them feature the Parachrom blue hairspring, which is robustly anti-magnetic, if not quite as anti-magnetic as the silicon in the Patek. Of course, the watch is rated from the factory to run no worse than -2 + 2 seconds per day, and it does receive a COSC chronometer certification on top of that. Let's zoom out for a moment and then talk about the Patek. Now, this silver white dial model is already discontinued. Yes, I know the 5711 is being discontinued, but this model, introduced in 2012 and discontinued in 2020, has already left the barn, as they say. Now, the timepiece is classically profiled, effectively the same size and shape as Gerald Genta envisioned back in 1976. The 5711, nevertheless, debuted in 2006, and again, this variant in 2012. 40 millimeters if we include a diagonal measurement of the case. If you actually measure the wings, it's 42 millimeters across. It is thin, 8.5 millimeters thick, 44.5 millimeters from lug to lug, and then if you include these end links, they swell out a little bit. They increase the distance across the wrist to a still manageable 48.5 millimeters. Now, when you throw it on the wrist, you can immediately see that this watch, especially with the white dial, is a little bit more dress inclined than the Rolex, though rated 120 meters, at face value, it's more water resistant. You can see it is super flat and flush, easily sliding underneath the cuff. A great unisex option, like the Rolex, only more so. This one will fit on a wrist easily as small as 13.5 centimeters circumference, and it's nowhere near pushing the limits of my wrist. As with just about every component of the Nautilus, the bracelet is hand finished, so this little bevel along the lugs, which actually does diminish as it approaches the clasp, it continues perfectly the bevel that runs along the hood of the lug. So you have the perfectly aligned bevel on the shoulders of the links and then the hood of the lugs. You have satin primaries, polished centers. You can see a big upgrade Rolex-wise over the Patek bracelet construction is that Rolex uses screw-fixed removable links here, and Patek, since 2012, has been using these pin sleeves, which is frankly a more primitive and cheaper way to assemble a bracelet. It's also a little bit different in how it works internally. It's a double fold deployment with a clamshell lock. The Rolex, you'll note, does have a clamshell lock, but it also has a lift lock. You see this beak and this hook internally? It latches once for security, and then it latches a second time, so there's an advantage there. Now, if you look at the rest of the bracelet, you'll realize the only way to size it is with these removable links. So you don't have easy link, you don't have the anchoring points via the divots that you'll find inside the Rolex clasp, but it is beautifully hand-finished. Everything, the bezel, the mid-case, the bracelet components, each individual link, the clasp. You can see not only why this watch costs so more at retail than the Rolex, but also why it costs more than the Aquanaut, which has nothing like this much complexity in its finish and case construction. Now, you can see here one of the refinements you get on a more expensive watch is more advanced and demanding construction. This watch has the rounded polygon bezel that Genta was working with in the 70s, but unlike the Royal Oak, the inner bezel, the crystal, and the dial all have that same faceting. This is more difficult to make, more expensive to make, and also more challenging to make water resistant. So that is one more feather in the cap of the Patek compared to the rather conventional and industrial combination of round bezel, round dial, and round crystal on the Rolex. The individual indices here are white gold, but along with the hands, they have been blackened, and you can see there's a lovely texture, horizontally striated, something that's been with the Nautilus long-term since the first models. You will appreciate, I hope, that I synchronized the seconds hands on these watches, in spite of the fact that this version of the Patek does not have hacking seconds. The last 5711s being built now, and having been built for the last year, do have hacking seconds. This one does not, but a little bit of back pressure, as ever, on the crown will allow you to effectively stop the seconds hand, and if you wish, with the Patek, synchronized the second. Flipping open the clasp one more time. We'll pop it open and take a look at the movement. As I mentioned, there's been a movement upgrade in the last year for the Nautilus. Caliber 324 is now caliber 26-330. The only substantive change has been that the movement now hacks on the latest version of the Nautilus. But you can see broadly it's a good-looking movement, if a bit generic. Patek uses this in every watch. The timepiece has a 35 to 45 hour power reserve, 8 beats per second, a 6-position adjustment like the Rolex, and when you combine the Patek Philippe seal, the 6-position adjustment, the free-sprung Gyromax balance, and the anti-magnetic silicon hairspring, Patek guarantees this watch will run no worse than -3 plus 2 seconds per day from the factory. You can also see that quite obviously the ungulage is mirrored and broad, the perlage is handsome, and it comes in several different sizes on different parts of the movements. The quotation of both linear and circular, and of course the very obvious advantage that you can see the movement on your Patek Philippe. And it's not a bad deal. If you buy it new for $33,710, I do feel like between the bracelet, the case, and the movement, you are getting $33,000 plus worth of fine finishing. And of course, it is a good looking movement, and one that has always been both a high horology ultra thin and a reliable timekeeper. Those two things don't always go together. So let's talk about the advantages of the Nautilus first. Obviously, the status of both the brand and the model. There's not much from a Gen Pop status perspective that can throw shade at Rolex. But these days, this model has become something more than just a luxury watch. And again, mostly via social media, it has penetration now into the mainstream population, and it has become an article of fashion. I will also say that in addition to its towering status and stature, there's also the fact that if you buy this watch for $33,710 new, you're never going to lose a cent, and I doubt you'll ever get less than twice your money if you choose to sell. I don't know if this watch will always cost the $100,000 we're asking for this example, but if you're buying this new, this is the one to buy new. Again, I'm not going to hold this against the watch. This model doesn't hack, but the latest 5711s do. So that is a technical refinement that it has gained. More parity, not superiority, but parity vis-a-vis the Rolex. You get a display case back, and again, with a watch that is this extensively hand-finished and a movement that is worth seeing, this is a feather in its cap and something that sets it apart from the mass-produced Rolex. It makes a big difference to me. It is thinner and more elegant. Everything about this watch is spare, telling, maximized without maximizing mass. And you can really see just how thin it is compared to the Rolex, which is a thin watch in its own right, but this is truly elegant. Now, handmade and hand-finished inside and out. We went over this. This is a product of craft art, not something that pops out of several jigs, lathes, and assembly lines as the Rolex will. I'll also mention that it has a longer track record of history and heritage. Normally when we talk about Rolex sports watches, we talk about the 50s and the 60s and the first models from back then, but this is a model that came out in 2012 based on a family that came out in 1992. So dating back to 1976, there is more history and heritage behind the Patek, and the fact that it has a known designer and a rock star designer makes it a little bit more humane and emotionally accessible, whereas with Rolex, only the brand counts and you will never know who designed your Yacht-Master. Now let's talk about the Yacht-Master. Okay, a lot to love here. A classic profile. If you want the classical Rolex look, you're not going to get it from a Nautilus, no matter the price. Here we have a rotating bezel, an Oyster cushion case, the 3-link Oyster bracelet. We have a crown guard structure, we have the Rolex crown on the dial, and the lovely Mercedes-Benz hour hand that we still associate with Rolex almost regardless of model. So this is that look. If you want the Rolex look, you can spend a hell of a lot less money than a GMT, a Daytona, or a Sub, or for that matter, a Nautilus. You can get this watch, which sells new for $12,450. You can get this one used box and papers for $12,000. So it's a great way to get into Rolex without a wait and without spending a fortune. So the 70-hour power reserve, I'm going to pretend we have a caliber 32-35 here. This is 45 hours best case scenario. They've been known to stop at 35 if the power runs down during the date change. The versions of this watch being made now have a 70-hour power reserve. This one, of course, is a 48. But just remember, if you're buying it new, you're getting the 70-hour. I would say better price new or used. Again, the fact that it sells used for about what it costs new, and the fact that there's not a big wait for new or used, tells me that this is a fairly priced watch. And you could get this watch, and you could get a Bulgari Octo Finissimo, and you could get a 2021 Corvette, and still have some cash left over for a road trip for the price you would pay to get this. I would also mention that this, when bought new, has a 5-year warranty, whereas this, regrettably, has a 2-year warranty when bought new. Now, it's a small distinction, but this watch is guaranteed to run -2 plus 2 seconds per day from the factory. This is guaranteed to run no worse than -3 plus 2 seconds. Why losing 3 seconds when Rolex only loses 2? And why losing more time than it's allowed to gain? I don't know, but advantage Rolex. I'm also going to mention that the bracelet's just better. It's more solid, more durable. It's not more hand-finished, but with removable links fixed by screws, the Easy Link system and the divots inside the clasp for sizing, and this double locking mechanism, it's just a better bracelet and clasp combination for a sports watch, and that by some margin. I'm also going to mention that the timing bezel is useful. Here it doesn't add a whole lot of thickness, but for me, I time events all the time, including this video, which I'm trying to keep under 17 minutes. So having that little timer built in adds a measure of utility, and since it is platinum, it also adds a measure of opulence and luxury. I'll also mention that the watch both looks and feels more substantial, especially where the bracelet and clasp are concerned. I have better feelings about the long-term durability of this watch if used as a sports watch than I do regarding the rather delicate Nautilus, which is fairly delicate inside and out. Also, Loom, you're going to see a Loom shot, but I think advantage Rolex. And then, of course, the fact that this watch will accept conventional straps. You're going to have to get an Everest or a rubber B, something that's fitted to the case to look natural. But short of Patek straps, you're not going to find a whole lot of options for this model. So which do I prefer? Honestly, for all the reasons I just detailed, I prefer the Rolex. Everything from the fact that it flies a little bit lower below the radar, to the use of a timing bezel, the physical superiority, the solidity of it, the superior loom, just the fact that the pricing is honest, whether you buy it new or used, and unlike most Rolex models, it's not hyped to death. So which of these two watches would I rather wear, cost no object? Probably the Nautilus in its latest version. But which of these watches, as I hold them in my hand, do I think is the better deal and the better watch to buy? It's going to be the Rolex for me. Guys, let me know, which one do you prefer between these two? And here we are. We're back with the Loom, and no joke, all three hands loomed and bigger plots of Loom, it's going to be the Rolex.